It was my first experience with mescaline, which is a psychoactive drug that's found in the peyote cactus and in many other cacti. And I had an experience with it, gosh, what was that, 45, 50 years ago. I saw colors that I was totally unfamiliar with. A flower had a color that I couldn't even give a name to. I had to recall memories of childhood. I was seeing with articulate clarity. And then I thought, why would 400 milligrams of a white crystal have all of this in it? What it's doing is allowing me to communicate with parts of me that I had not communicated with for a long time.
In the last few decades, an awful lot has happened. I was working in the lab. But not much. I was working in the lab maybe 4, 6 months ago, and I ran out of methylene chloride, called dichloromethyl methylene chloride. A solvent used. It was first introduced about 1955, 1960, when they discovered they could chlorinate natural gas with a machine and solvent. It was unknown in the 40s, and we used it for everything. And I was out of it, and we had a little chemical supply house over in the local town known as Concord, and it's called Alpha Chemicals. And so I got on the phone call. I had met the people there before. They're moderately loose, okay people. They provided essential chemicals such as phosphorus and iodine and other things we use in making meth, but also solvents and such that we use in a normal laboratory. And I phoned them and I asked, do you have any methylene chloride? And she said, let me take a look, just hang on a minute. Came back in a minute on the phone and said, got about 4 gallons. He said, put it aside, I'll be over there in 20 minutes and pick it up. He said, I'll right for you. Hi, Annie, got chairs up here if you want. Good. And I'll be over in a few minutes and pick it up. He said, fine. About 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And then over about 2:30 or so, and she had 4 gallons. And I said, how much is that? And she said, $120. However, she said, we have a little paperwork to do for the state. I said, oh, fine. And so she got out this series of forms that had to be filled out. What is it you're buying? 4 gallons of methylene chloride. Next line, what are you going to use it for? Research. Next line, what is your full name? I wrote down my full name. Next line, identification number from state-issued identification. So I always, when anybody asks me for identification, I pull out the passport. It starts a dialogue, which I love getting into. A passport? Yes, you have a passport? Well, no, why not? And I get this thing going with people who safely checking calendars and cashiers here and there. And I love getting into that because I find a lot of people never heard of passports. And I said, have you ever read The Last Train from Berlin? No. And so I always keep this little harangue going about people getting passports and having their pen. And so I pull out a passport. No, she said, by law it has to be state-issued identification. You have a driver's license. That's the only thing I have to state-issued identification. So I brought it out, down with the number, a telephone number, a license plate number on the car I came with. A payment must be in this way, but not that way. Anything bought in the state of California that has anything to do with chemicals or chemistry or laboratory things that goes over $100 of full paperwork has to be done. And so I knew that this had been developed in this way. I've been following it. I said, how am I late enough to run into visitors as I leave? And she looked at her watch and said, I think you're about a half an hour too early. Anyone who comes and buys chemicals and is there at 3:30 or later, the Concord police are down the street and around the corner and stop the car as it goes away and goes to time. Oh, you had a weedy license plate or something. Where were you? I was down there. What were you doing? Buying some chemicals for? And this is routine in California. The eastern Concord, this place, Concord. And I kind of hope I'd run into them and kind of neat because I have no intention of telling you what I intend to do with it. This is proprietary information. If you're really interested, read my patent advisory and see where that one goes up to a certain point. I like being in the corner. After that point, I just get out safely. I stop being again. Yeah, totally. Still arguing. And so I was reminded an interesting thing as I was driving back home, 4 gallons of back forward in the back of the car. about 65 years earlier. This is my start in chemistry. This is the start of my talk. My start in chemistry is back, I'm maybe 8, 9, 10 years old, and I had been given a Gilman chemistry set. Gilbert chemistry set, which had a nice series of about 12 little things. Logwood, I've never yet have found out what logwood is for. Something bicarbonate of soda, these are aggressive chemicals you have to be careful of. Salt, odds and ends like this, in which you add this to this and it'll bubble, you add this and it turns green or blue or something. And I had this in the basement, back of the house. That door had 5 steps going toward the street and had about 15 steps going downward that went up 4 steps into the backyard. At the very bottom of the 15 steps, the door going into the basement. That was my laboratory. I was about 8 years old. I was enamored with chemistry. I really loved it. I did everything I could, combined everything with everything, and got all the bubbles and colors I could possibly do. But I also had a bicycle. And down on the corner of Spruce and Rose in Berkeley, where I live, if you go down Rose Street, far enough, across Shattuck, down across Grove, and down by Roosevelt High School, or Junior High School, there's a street, McGee Street, and to the left on McGee Street, there's a place called University Apparatus Company. I love the place because they're the ones who provided all the chemicals to the university. They were, in essence, the stockroom provider of chemicals for UC Berkeley up there. But also, they're very neat. And I go down there in my bicycle and I pull into the thing and go in and talk to them and say, you're an 8-year-old kid coming in and saying, I'd like a can of ether and I'm out of sodium nitrite and I've got plenty of sulfur and other carbon and things like that. But I would like to have some of this, some of that, and some of those, and do you have any of that? Okay, sure, here's the ether, here's that. We don't have any small bottles here. I'll give you a little bit out of the big bottle. Put a little bit in a small bottle for me. And very often not even charged. This was the rapport between the university and its supplier and people and the concept of individual exploration. And this was very real. And I remember that was great. I knew 50 other people who were involved in the same thing. We explored little things. We mix this and put a match to it and we get a loud noise. Marvelous! Okay. You add this and this to this and then add a little bit of sodium sulfide and you stink out the whole neighborhood. Marvelous! And this was great sport. And you're blowing up things and see if you get a cut. Get cured from the cut. And this was, remember in high school, I was really exploring. I loved physics and chemistry. The physics was what is so washing soda, and chemistry is how do you clean glass right. I mean, that was a sophistication. But we got much further than that. We found they had a gas jet in the physics lab. And I found that it had some weather balloons back in the other area. And we'd get together and fill one of these weather balloons with gas from the gas thing. And tie a long string out with a little bit of kerosene on the string. And take it up in the playground, up behind the thing. And let it there. Our idea was to light the fuse and let the thing go. And watch it go up in the air with the fuse burning and then up in the air. That was our dream. And we had this all thing going, but it never occurred to me that gas was denser than air. And so this thing would go with the fuse lit sideways over against the fence. And then it went off. You got criticized for your severity. This was the beginning, to me, the beginning of chemistry. The idea of mix things and see what comes out. At that time, this was in the 30s. At that time, the only psychedelics that were known at all were mescaline and the components. They didn't have the right structure of it yet. They were on the right direction. Of marijuana, THC of marijuana, and before LSD, before psilocybin, before psilocybin, before DMT, all these. That's pretty much it. I mean, it was a real. I had no idea psychedelics were all that was clean. I was just launched into chemistry, learning how to move. Yeah. Fine, if I prance around, it makes into the pool. I'll try to stand in one place. It's good for about 10 seconds.
It's very long, actually.
It is?
Beautiful.
Modern age. Easier back in the 30s. They had little crystal sets, so that's another story. In fact, I found that crystal sets, you can communicate by means of Ford spark coil. Oh, that was marvelous. You take a Ford spark coil and go rattle, rattle, rattle with that, and you make a static. And I could communicate with a friend of mine up on Grizzly Peak Boulevard because he had a little crystal set that would make noises. I made things down in Spruce Street. And we'd communicate, we'd buzz, and he'd hear my Morse code, and he'd answer by Morse code. about 2 miles. Never really seriously treated, so we're messing up every radio in between. It didn't matter. It was a very neatly pre-World War II time in which there was a very great emphasis on human beings and human behavior, humans going on. And that evolved into my say I went to school at Harvard in the early 40s. At Berkeley, they had, I'll get the psychedelics then. Oh,
You're doing wonderful.
thank you. And you're here somewhere here. You have the clock. Could you wave your hand when my time is up? Okay, because I have a table, but
What time does she start?
she starts halfway between when I started and 12:30. Oh, slide rule. That's not a birthday class in Berkeley, also not. Slide rule, I'm just going to calculate the time for you. And I asked this class, as I usually love asking questions, I don't know if they can answer or not. What is a logarithm? And almost everyone in the class brought out from her purse pocket a calculator. And I said, I just don't want to know what the logarithm of a given number is. I want to know what a logarithm is. And people, no one actually knew. They knew how to do things with logarithms, but they didn't know what a logarithm is. And so I said, that's how a slide rule works. Oh my God. Now, one person in the class of 75 undergraduates knew what a slide rule was. Everything was calculated. In the old days, when they first went to Cal, all they had a K and K or K and E or something hanging from their belt, and they go around there, obviously in engineering. Now they have a little black thing hanging from their belt, and they do electronics on it. And so what I brought in, I had borrowed from a friend a 6-foot-long slide rule, and brought it in and hung it in front of the class, and we had a lecture on logarithms slide rule next day. Anyway, what I did, I had at Berkeley, we had a process that's known as Subject A. How many people have been at Berkeley, UC Berkeley?
On the campus.
On campus, yeah. Well, not in the state. But they had what they call Subject A. You had to pass it to prove you knew the English language and where to put the comma and how to define a verb. And I knew how to talk, kind of, but I didn't know the fine details. I certainly didn't know the protocol needed to get through this thing, which was to write an essay. Was one of the problems. I had to write an essay. And I blew it the whole thing. Which meant if I went to Cal, I had to take the course in Subject A, which was a no-credit course. And once you pass it and pass it correctly, you're absolved of having to do any more required courses in that area. And of course, I flunked the test, because I didn't have the essay satisfactory. And so I was told, you'll have to take the course in there. Well, it turned out I got a national scholarship to Harvard instead. And so I went to Harvard as an undergraduate there, which was a total disaster. But at least I didn't have to take such a course. And so once I was there, it turned out that I was very much in the minority. I was a little snotty, wise-ass, intelligent, and very independent kid. And all the other people around me, to a large measure, were the rich kids and people who donated to the alumni of Harvard and had that little social status. And I didn't fit with anyone. And so the easy thing was to join the Navy, which I did in the Navy for a few years, Atlantic odds and ends. And in there, I got my first move from chemistry into psychological chemistry, mental chemistry. I wrote about this in the first of the books, but I'll give you a little background of it. In the Navy, we're sort of 2 or 3 days out in off of the coast of England, in the Atlantic. We're a submarine detail looking for submarines. They're looking for us. It was an interesting, not quite dialogue, but it taught me that there are people who are aggressive as I am on the other side of aggression toward me. So I learned to be modest in my displaying my aggression. Still, aggression there, but I just hide much more usefully. Anyway, so I was there, and out there, and I got this tremendous infection in my thumb. And I didn't know what to do about it. It was very painful. We had on the little DE square escort a thing called sick bay, and I kept appealing to people there. I'm dirty. They said, no problem, morphine, and that's fine. And I was sort of riding the next few days on periodic and quite regular morphine injections. Which, I mean, the pain was still there. I didn't give a shit. It didn't bother me. The strange way of putting pain aside, I found that fascinating. Why is it I have a pain and it doesn't hurt? And that got my attention a little bit. And I get a shot of morphine, I can deal cards, I continue to play poker down below there. Go upstairs, listen to telescopes, and poker things. And then we finally got into Liverpool, and I was being taken off to a military hospital. But the ship right alongside our ship was a British counterpart of the DE, I suppose it's called. It had its own name, about 300 people, 200 people long, 200 people. And since I was a petty officer, with the stripes on one arm but nothing on the hat, I was invited to petty officer group aboard this British ship, and just I got sloppy drunk. What they were drinking is a mixture of beer and very hard liquor. I forget what it was. But they blend the two together in mixed drinks. In 2 hours of that, I wasn't very good. That plus the morphine was putting me in a very strange place. And then when I got into, finally took me by ambulance over to some army hospital somewhere. And they looked at this thing, you got to have surgery on that. And they gave me, at this point, I remember very clearly, a glass of orange juice is quite solid for fun. And I said, they are joking me. You're going to drug me. And I'm not going to, I will take it, I will drink it, I will eat the white solid. But I'll prove to them I am macho enough not to succumb to their subtle drug game and make me unconscious or something. So I drank the orange juice and ate the solid, and strictly just went out. I disappeared. And I came around about 45 minutes later. They had given me phenobar, by the way, as some bars, as an IV interject, as an anesthetic. So they could do surgery on my thumb. And I was supposed to come out of that in 3 minutes. I came out of that in a half an hour. And so they hoped I was okay. They did not realize my previous drug history of that day. It was quite colorful. And I asked, what was the drug you put in that orange juice? But that's not drug, that was sugar. And that was my big lesson. As if a half teaspoon of sugar could knock me out for a half an hour. I learned what's meant by placebo reaction. It's a very real thing. And that caught my attention in saying there are things that affect the mind and the mind's behavior and the mind's going on. They cannot easily be explained in terms of chemistry. And so that got me into psychopharmacology of chemistry. People kind of neat. I got through that kind of stuff. We still have a short run. Got back into, I still Harvard, went back to Berkeley, took undergraduate work in chemistry, graduate work in biochemistry, and got totally fascinated and combed the literature. So this time, this was in the late 40s. LSD was known, but there's still no DMT, no copy DMT. These were unknown materials. But I was intrigued what was known. I perceived mescaline as a priority in the various chemicals that were known in mescaline. I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4 chemicals are known. Now there are 60 known. At that time there were 4. 1 phenethylamine mescaline, 2 phenethylamine methylmescaline, and 2 isophenol alkaloids. And I was intrigued. Anything that would affect the mind or the mental control of the body. I was intrigued with drugs that were known, for example, yohimbine. At that time, had a tremendous reputation of being aphrodisiac. Well, I was not. I heard of my virginity in England. So I was not totally alien to this type of world. And so I found yohimbine on the shelf of the biochemical laboratory there and swallowed various amounts of it. Vasodilator. Everything goes flaccid, but the flaccid is big, but flaccid big is not hard. And that was not satisfactory for me. So I explored other things that went in the same general area, and read what I could in literature. Somewhere got into graduate school, and about this time, DMT had been reported as being in plants. I was intrigued by what I could see in that area. A fellow named Stephen Dara in NIMH in Washington synthesized all kinds of new things that were homologs. He kept injecting himself and injecting his friends, and I was watching this with a great deal of interest and curiosity about what would come out of it. It turned out, I subsequently talked to a chemist who had been not a graduate student, sort of a perennial postdoc in his laboratory for a year. So, I won't give his name, you might know him. But he had for about 30, 40 years, and still functional as a postdoc. And he goes to a laboratory, I'd like to do postdoctorate work, give me a little bit of money, and they say, here's what we're working on. He'll do a tremendously interesting work, learn a lot of chemistry, publish a paper or two, and then go to another laboratory for a year. He's been doing it for 40 years. He's never had a position. He's been a perennial postdoc. He's been charming now. Well, he's a postdoc for Sarah back in NIMH for a year. And he told me that Sarah made a number of compounds, but he had a technician who was doing getting the things prepared for microanalysis. And she was more interested in being correct in her own eyes and getting credit for what's going on than actually doing a correct job. She's not totally honest. And the latter compounds that she had made, or she had assayed and evaluated, were actually not the amines that should have been tried but the amides or the acids from which we need should have been made and were not successfully made. So he told me he read the little notebooks I've never been able to hold them. I'd like to see them sometime. And said the last 3 compounds of Stevens reported, so don't believe the results. And the results were, on injection, they didn't have any effect. And so I held this in the billings, and I began realizing there's a lot of this injectable things that caught my fancy, but not enough to get me actually into that aspect of the area. And so I got involved with a very good friend who knew about peyote. This is probably latter part of the 50s. And one dear friend of mine said, you know, I got the mescaline sulfate. Would you like to try it? I said, sure. Good idea. So that was that aspect of rigidity law. Was this mescaline sulfate. I was totally fascinated with it. Curious to the molecule. How many people have seen actual sulfate rather than hydrochloric? Beautiful. Long needles. Gorgeous. Just gorgeously. The mercury index gives a 6-degree melting point range. It turns out whoever did the original melting had a slightly moist sample and it melted over 6 degrees. And to show originality and confirmation of other researchers, everyone who's ever made it subsequently, I've seen, gives that same 6-degree range. They take it right out of mercury index, jam it in. Oh, we were a little bit higher than that. No, it should have been that. We'll put that. So the mercury index number has now been confirmed by about 15 papers. Don't believe it. Because actually, if you dry it out, it's not a bit higher. So you can put the industry too. Anyway, that was my first experience, 150 milligrams of mescaline sulfate. There were about 10 of us together. About 5 of us took it and 5 were babysitters. And that is really what turned my whole world around into the area of psychedelic drugs. The experience started in the morning. I was very much enamored driving up Dixieland Road to the top of the thing. They had some weird music on something with Bernstein on the radio that I really locked into. I got up to the top. My late wife was one of the takers of the experiment too. And she and I, getting out of the car on Disney Boulevard, I remember this great clarity. Outside of the car was a gravel edge of the road that went over the cliff that went all over the cliff. And that gravel edge had little stones that were red and blue and green and what have you. Just beautiful cascades of heaven. All colors in the world. And the colors were arranged in most dramatic coordination. Who could have put the time to put this together this way? Neither of us could get out of the car. Because to get out of the car, we have to step on this artwork and become it. And so it's very costly to get out of the car by getting over the stone operation and down on the other side, look back at it, and the next thing I knew, I had seen a little plant that was flowering over the side, and there was a bee. The next thing, I got plant. And I went over and watched that bee. And it's incredible. I didn't realize bees had great big hip pockets on both sides, and so they just pollen and all kinds of roots down in there. And I watched that bee, and the bee kind of glanced at me, gorgeous. Went on and did its little flower thing, and I just watched total fascination the interaction between the bee and the flower, and then the interaction between me and the bee. I looked at the flower right now. This is the dialogue I had going, and this was just, it must have been an hour and a half for that bee to collect pollen all that flower. It seemed that way. I watched this entire operation going on. Then I got later on over to the flower area, and I got one of these flowers. And in the middle of this flower, down in the bowels of the flower, was the most beautiful gradation of color I've ever seen in my life. It went down deeper, darker, darker. But as it went down deeper and darker, it changed color, it changed hue. It went from one aspect of the spectrum to another, all the way down. And I kept the flower for a long time, just as a souvenir of what went on. I saw colors that day that, frankly, cannot exist. I've always been really colorblind. And all of a sudden, I saw shades and varieties of colors that were actually unprecedented in my mind. I remembered it. I still think it was colorblind, but that day is vivid. But the big lesson out of that day, at the end of the day, finally got back on the 13 things that no longer playing on the radio. I got back, and I was totally entranced, and then I was totally wrong in what I came to as a conclusion. I came to the conclusion that this drug, this mescaline drug, did extremely powerful, incredible, revealing, open things to me. And I thought this thing a little bit more clearly and said, that's not ridiculous. This drug is 350 milligrams of a white crystalline salt. It doesn't have inside of it these colors, this understanding, this appreciation, this awareness, all that. That's all it needs. And all this drug does is allow me to see what this is. And let that come out, a catalytic concept. Let it come out of me. What is in there all the time, I've never looked at before. So that really got me. And if this little, no, I will use a, oh, blue on black. I black on white. And you're on it, where'd you go? You're on it 11:15. Okay, I'll do that. I started at 9:30, but they had 10 o'clock up here. Okay. I'm going to draw one or two dirty pictures, and then that'll be it for the day. When I gave the lecture a couple of days ago, I used a great wiggle, and a star in the middle of it. I said, this is a very stable, and I said mildly basic thing. In this case, it's a benzene ring. Here's the two bumps. I said 2 carbon separations, and a very simple strong base. See, let's have a weak base, 2 carbon separations, and a strong base. That's methyl butane. So mescaline is trimethoxyphenethylamine. A very simple molecule, very simple to synthesize. I went off in the lab and synthesized it with no problem. That time I was working in an industrial laboratory at the Dow Chemical Company. And I was going to name it. Pardon? Oh, okay. I was working that time in a industrial laboratory called Dow Chemical Company. And when I wrote the book, I ended up calling it the Dole Chemical Company. I was going to name it CAU Chemical Company. I thought that wouldn't be particularly subtle. So I went to Dole instead of the teacher Dow. And I synthesized it. By God, I confirmed indeed it did what it was supposed to do. So at this point, I'm reviewing the history of things. LSD now is known. DMT is just at this stage being discovered as being psychoactive. So that's just breaking forth the work that's going on in the eastern part of the United States. THC was still structurally unknown. And I was involved in this. And I began to say, if a simple molecule like this can reveal what's in me, can pull stuff out of my unconscious in this way, what would happen if I mucked around the molecule a little bit? And there's a lot of things to do that. So what I did, I'll just point. Here's a beautiful thing up here. If you were to put a methyl group, I will do a little bit of chemistry, then I'll get away from here. A methyl group down there, you have what is known in the generic trade as amphetamine. And amphetamine doesn't have any this garbage on the left. But if you put that garbage on the left and have an amphetamine, you have something, well, what's called trimethoxyamphetamine. I gave the name of trimethoxyamphetamine, and the abbreviated TMA, which is part of a long cascade of letter codes that I sort of stuck in the literature. So I made TMA, worked up to where I got active. It's actually about twice as potent as mescaline, twice the size. Active, fair amount of color, but none of the drama of mescaline. I still had my little flower left over from the earlier, it was actually a little flower, but the same type of flower with an opening rose-like thing. It was on the coffee table, which I enamored with mescaline. I looked at this flower and said, yeah, it's kind of pretty down in there. I worked inside it. I tore apart from the inside. Something I could not have done before. But I did in it, casually tear something apart to investigate. Entirely different work. In an experiment with several people who knew mescaline, we got into this sort of thing, and a lot of new interesting arguments came out, which is not at all common with mescaline. And music was involved again, but of all things, they had Slaughter on Fifth Avenue, was it? Slaughter on something. Slaughter on Fifth Avenue?
Fifth Avenue.
Fifth Avenue. Slaughter on one of those avenues in New York, on the radio, which is a very aggressive thing, and it probably kindled in the direction with the group that was doing the experiment. But we ended up not very good friends for a while. It was a strange change from mescaline to this. I said, hey, that's bringing out a whole new bunch of things out of individuals. And so, there's a certain amount of, what's a graceful way of saying anywhere candy dishing, German? Teutonic enthusiasm. I succumb to. And so, if one carbon does that, what about 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? And so, I just went down the line, and I went to the lab, and I synthesized 2 carbon compounds, 3 carbon, 4, 5, 6. I was due the 7, but didn't have the starting material, so I jumped to the number 8. So I had a whole cascade of white solids along the line, lower melting points to the right. And I just going to go through all of these and see what other things revealed. So by the time I made the 8th of these things, I had actually the 2nd of these things, no activity at all. So it suddenly occurred to me, this can't be the end of the line, but it tells me that this is not the direction in which things will develop. So I kept the most active of those, the one with this methyl group there, and, and you have 3 things on a hexagon, one end of which is hang a hexagon from a Christmas tree, you have 5 things around here. I have things put on this way. How many ways can you attach 3 things to a dangling hexagon on a Christmas tree? 6 ways. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 5, 2, 3, 6, 2, 4, 5, 2, whatever it is. 2, 4, 6. 6 ways of doing it. I made all 6. Made the other 5. I put them along in a row and began assaying each of those. The very first of these, which is the one I'm going to start really different. The first arrangement is this is 3, 4, 5. The first one is 2, 4, 5. And we'll talk about that later. If you'll let me go from here, no. Here, probably a better way to do that. Here, I'll rotate the molecule upside down. So you have 2, 4, 5. This is the second one that I synthesized. So I called it TMA2. And it was active, but I was quite surprised with its activity. Just slowed down at this point. I made the compound, and that assayed at 2 milligrams nothing, 5 milligrams nothing, 10 milligrams nothing, or maybe a little something, I don't know. So I took 20 milligrams, and I learned at that point, when you find a little something at one level, you don't double up that level. So I found myself wanting to get out of the flow of people. And the only place out of the flow of people was the janitor's closet that led to the place in there. So I went into the janitor's closet and closed the door from inside so no one would stumble across where I was. And I got quite fascinated with the stuff the janitor uses to clean up things, brushes, soup pans, sawdust with heat in it, and oil this, and wax that, and lubricate yonder. And I got totally fascinated in the janitor's complimentary equipment. But I was in there for about an hour and a half before I realized I think I now can come out and face the world. And so I learned a good lesson that you don't just leap up into new levels unless you have a plan or a retreat or some way of getting out of the flow of things. So TMA2 proved to be 10 times more potent than TMA. So suddenly I realized that there is an element of potency that is very real, and my first approach was to find the most potent. And I've backed away from that now to find the most interesting, the most revealing, the most productive. And it's nice that it's potent because you don't take as much material. But on the other hand, potency is almost secondary to the quality and nature of the actual intoxication itself. So I ran through the other 4 of them, and one area that I found to be absolutely fascinating, if they're all on opposite corners, if I share this loop with you, instead of boom, boom, bing, boom, boom, bong, if you put it in 2, 4, 6 position, TMA 6 is the 6 of the 6 I made, it's almost equally potent. Well, initially it wasn't. Do you remember that football game at Berkeley, a Cal football game you were at? Oh, okay. You remember the Cal football game you were at? And since we had already checked it was not sticky active, we took a slightly larger dose of fuel into the Cal football game we were playing something in the Cal Stadium, and we both, I just had 40 or 50 milligrams of TMA6 on board. And about the end of the first quarter, we kind of wish we were not at the football. It came in a very, very distinct manner. It's very, very, not colorful, not motion so much as really kind of stone, but a good stone. And we got in there, we got through that safely, and we went down to dinner at Springer's down at the University of Berkeley. That was not a good choice. Not the blue Texas, but we were not. It told me that 245 and 246 both are very active orientations, and not having 2 lives to lead, I've led the 245 ones where I just nibble a little bit in the 246. So I put all the information in the and somewhere along the line, I don't know who it is, some chemist down the line, maybe 10 years over there, perhaps over younger, in Switzerland or something, is going to find the 246 and say, hey, these things are just as active. Why not doing the 246? What got done in the 245? And he's going to find a fabulous area, I'm sure, of pharmacology. But for him to find, I'm off in other areas. But I went back and used this 245 as the fundamental structural nucleus of everything that's going to do. So having found this, what are you going to do? Well, methoxy, there is one group, large methoxy, called the ethoxy, E for ethoxy, N for methoxy. So I took each of the 3 methoxy groups and put an ethoxy in itself, 3 separate states. And then to be systematic, I took 2 and 2 and all. So I made the 6th possible ethoxy homologue. The 4-ethoxy, the one that's down opposite that chain, is the only one that was active, so I stuck with that. Made the propoxy, butoxy also active. Then I began exploring other aspects of this. I made the methane dioxy, well, with 2 methoxy, with the methoxy, with 2 methoxy, with no methoxy. With no methoxy was a known compound at that point called MDA, and that led to the methylation of MDMA, which was the nucleus, and set back in this weird exploration, at least in my mind, in this weird exploration of these various pictures. But the really interesting direction I got at that point that I found to be real fascinating was taking that form, the methoxy position, and that's the first thing I said to myself, what if you take that methoxy off, which could hydrolyze off? It could be a metabolic fragility point in that molecule. And take that form methoxy and put something on that couldn't hydrolyze off. And so I said, put a methyl group on. So I took the methoxy off, so to speak, on the blackboard, using the laboratory to start with different things, and made 2,5-dimethoxy 4-methyl amphetamine. I said, you know, it's a situation, you know, I've left out this point. In fact, I had written a patent on this new compound a minute ago. Made the 4-methyl compound. I said, a situation that you can't lose. If this material gets to the reactive site, wherever that is in the brain, and goes into that site, and is active, you got yourself a wild psychedelic. If it gets into that site successfully and is not active, you have something that blocks that site and might keep metal in it. Either way, you've got to win it. So that's all you need. Make the compound. Made it. It turned out to be a very, very potent compound, long-lived and potent. Since I'd taken the oxygen off, I called it desoxy. I put a methyl group on. I put methyl on, so I called it DOM. So desoxymethyl, I made desoxyethyl, desoxypropyl, DOCP, DOPR. But DOM turned out to be an interesting complication in its own way. I remember I gave a seminar at Johns Hopkins on this sort of thing. I was now had left out. Gave a seminar at Johns Hopkins and talked about this DOM compound. And I should have been attending to the fact there were a couple of very casually dressed people in the audience. Long hair, Haight Ashbury type clothes. I realized later that they were Haight Ashbury, I think. And they caught the structure of DOM and they were taking scribble notes and they disappeared. And I was over in the Haight Ashbury at that time, in the ages of 1966, 67. We were talking about that the other day, the Summer of Love. And I was up to medical school trying to learn where the anatomy of the brain was. In medical school, I remember walking through the Haight Ashbury, and I remember very specifically, that day we were having a quiz later today on the circle of Willets. And I was wondering how many entries there were around the little circle of Willets in the brain. That was my memory thing. I was reading the notes. All around me people were stoned, and what they called SCP. And I had no idea what SCP was, except it stood for serenity, tranquility, and placidity. And no one could say placidity, so it came out to be serenity, tranquility, and peace. And in the local jargon, it became stop the police, and in the police jargon, it became too stupid to puke. You had this general thing everywhere. And what had kind of happened, apparently someone had gotten my lecture array and knew it was a very potent compound, and made it up, but of all things, since they must have tried it themselves, they made it up not in 5 milligram tablets, which would be a good level. So 5 milligrams is quite enough. You're into it for quite a while. They made it up in 20 milligram tablets. Because they had tried it and they found out it didn't come on very fast. And so people were told it's kind of like LSD. They take a 20 milligram tablet, and an hour later not much is happening. They could take another tablet. You had people coming in to Haight Ashbury clinic with 40 milligrams on board. Or something with 5 milligrams, right out of it. And so it got a very bad reputation very quickly, very roughly. And they didn't know what it was. I was asked, what is this thing? I have no idea. It took me 6 months to uncover that really big. It was Yellowstone. It connected SCP to my DOM some years earlier. Anyway, that was a development in that direction that was rather interesting extension of the psychedelic area. From that, I said, well, if a methyl group does all this, what is my time? What's
right behind you? Your phone.
Oh, 20 to 11. 11. I aim for roughly 11. And then we have questions.
You drop.
No, speak louder. There is a microphone up here for you, by the way, kiddo. I got one here. I'll speak louder. Remind me, I know to pull an ought and fade away into the distance again. No crickets out there. No, we're okay. So I said, if a great big group like a methyl group gets on there and it makes them last a long time and can't metabolize off, what about putting other things on there that won't metabolize off? What happens? So I put a fluorine, a chlorine, a bromine, and an iodine. Fluorine, not interesting. Chlorine, not interesting. Bromine, interesting. So at the field M, I called it DOB, and found a fascinating compound out of it. Again, it takes a few hours to come on. It lasts for the rest of the day and into the next morning. and you are finally filtering off maybe 24 hours later. We did this fascinating work at Berkeley. At this point, I had already resolved my relationship with industry, resolved my relationship with medical school, and completed what I wanted to do at medical school, and I got involved with the nuclear medicine crowd over at Berkeley, which was marvelous. They had equipment you could not imagine, something we couldn't afford to buy. Cyclotrons, gamma scanners, all this beautiful stuff. And I worked with people who had the keys to everything. And we just did whatever we wanted to do. It actually right. So we did. We went up cyclotron and made some bromine 82 and put bromine 82 in the DOB and put the DOB in the arm to see what happens. You lay down on a scanner. The little bed moves along across the room. Under the bed is a battery of gamma detectors that are about 50 or so gamma detectors. And as the bed moves over the top, it's as if the gamma detector is moving up the body. And on the screen over there, down from the what do you call the horizontal thing or screen, and it would show where the gamma detector is sitting. You see an outline of the body. And then up to the bed again, do it again, and again, another outline of the body. About every minute, you get an outline of the body. And we're all done. You photograph these, you run it as time-lapse photography, and see the dynamics of that chemical, that radioisotope going into the body. That is what. We put it in there, stand over there. First thing, of course, a little floppy injection, a little bit of radioactivity around here. You can see the bladder grow from a ping pong ball to a cantaloupe over a couple of hours because the radiochemicals being collected in the bladder. You knew that was. And in the body, about 4 or 5% of the radiation went into the lungs, but not the brain. Totally fascinating. The activity of this thing is in the lungs. The lungs have a lot of neurons in it. So you want all these things to know, the psychedelics turn on, mental process, brain. Or by the spleen maybe, but not the lung. But anyway, it went into the lung, and then after about an hour, hour and a half, the lung level began dropping down, but the brain level started up. And apparently something that's going in the lung is probably the second best metabolizer in the body, next to the liver. And finally, the lung is converting this thing into something else. It still carries the radioactive bromine, but into the brain, and then it's when you begin to turn on. So the lung is sort of so the lung is really producing treating the bromo compounds of prodrug as being metabolized to something that goes into the brain, and that's the active material. And this has been a month trying to isolate it, and we've never found it, but it is. But it's fascinating. So then someone made the interesting suggestion, what I bet you did, I bet you injected particulate stuff, and it got caught in the circulation of the lung, that's why it did. So we made another batch of it and swallowed it instead, so it has to go through the gut. It still went to the lung. And I've got some beautiful photographs. In fact, that's how I met this gal before I met Anne. She was on the research group at Lawrence Lab. And I have a photograph of most of us lying on the thing, but in her case, it's a different picture entirely of her transparency on the oscilloscope. And it's quite a different shape than the rest of it. And no, it was. That's another story. Then we got into pursuing further. The iodo compound is totally fascinating. Also long-lived. Still dosage, maybe 2 or 3 milligrams orally, all you need. Take effect in 3 or 4 hours. And getting pretty effective. It got to last 36 hours. So it's not really one of these weekend things, but it's a very interesting thing. It's one of the most potent, serotonin agonists that's known, being sold commercially, by the way. DOB got a wild popularity about 15 years ago and was placed on the schedule of drug list. But DOIs are never found. And so there are these companies that sell neurotransmitter agonists and what have you. I forget the name of it, the East Coast. 3-letter job. RBI. And they sell DOI as a research chemical. And once they discovered it was a psychedelic, they tripled the price, but it's still being sold. And DOB is illegal, DOI is totally not good, illegal, that is. And so if you want to get some D or L isomers with a very interesting psychedelic, have a good letterhead, and contact the company.
They were bought by Sigma.
Right?
They were bought by Sigma. You now have to go through the Sigma.
Oh my, it's a Sigma, and that Sigma's bought by Aldrich.
Yep. No, it's all one now.
All one thing. Yeah, they used to have laws against monopolies. I think they got okay, and that was the OI. What happened then? Sort of rattling along. I still got some time. What I did, I originally had started with methyl, which had 2 carbons. Methyls, without this methyl group. So I went back to that phenethylamine entity. I said, all these interesting compounds are kind of neat. What would happen if you made the same thing but with a 2-carbon background? And so this I dubbed the whole group of things 2C for 2 carbon, and went back to the whole thing again. 2CD, 2CT, 2CCT, 2C, well, T came in a little later. 2CB for the global compound, 2CI for the iodo. There's another example. The 2CB is a Schedule 1 drug in the United States. 2CI is equally potent, totally unscheduled, a little harder to make, but not that much harder to make. So these things are out there. Then I said, you know, if another heteroatom hadn't even considered was sulfur, and so I put sulfur in there, and sulfur and thiol, so I call that 2CT. Made a whole bunch of these, up to about 20, 25, 20, 25 or something. And I saw something that's going to be an unlimited, unending task. Because you can put fluorines out there, you can put oxygens out there. Beyond the sulfur, I can make compounds of fluoro, oxygen, sulfur, carbon, hydrogen, and that's 6 atoms. That is the new atom record. I wonder how to make 7, but I haven't figured out a way yet. In one psychedelic compound. And so I stopped at about T20 or 25, because I thought it was going to go on forever and be totally captivating, but absolutely boring from the point of view of discovery. All new compounds have been reactive, but not new structures. So I sort of abandoned the T thing and went to the other half of the coin, which is the tryptamine, which had not been well explored. There's it here. One more dirty picture. Again, the wing of the other day's lecture, the wiggle star, and the thing inside of it. In this case, is an entirely different type of structure. I'll turn around and shot in a moment. This material is known as tryptamine, and in my eyes, it's the second half of the psychedelic world. Instead of the system being a hexagon aromatic stability, this happens to be a 2-ring system, but it's, again, an aromatic stability point with 2 carbons and out to nitrogen. Exactly the same type of system as the phenethylamine. It metabolizes and splits and does all kinds of things in the same general sort of way to dimethyltryptamine, known with an oxygen here, which is psilocin, as the phosphate ester is psilocybin, known as the oxygen out here. This is the diphotine that Jonathan was talking about at some length. And there's a methyl group out there, you have 5-methoxy DMT. This is basically what was known at that time. Let me put a wire over here, some hang right. So, what are you going to do with it? Well, start out with the easiest group to work on, the N-methyl. And ethyl is known, happen to be illegal, so I should have said one more. The N-ethyl, di-ET is known. But disopropyl, diisopropyl, dibutyl, diamyl, polymethylene were not known, so I made them. And began teaching them in the same sort of way. And one of the fascinating early ones was the N-diisopropyl tryptamine. Isopropyl is a 3-carbon job put in the middle instead of at the end. So it's an iso, sort of normal. I made the N-diisopropyl tryptamine. I remember that one very clearly. I was in the kitchen, and I had tried, I think I was up to 20 milligrams and 30 milligrams, kind of looking for visuals, looking for color, for artwork, what have you. And I heard this horrid piece of music on the radio. And it turns out to be Britain Young People's Guide to the Symphony in Britain. Playing Young People's Guide to the Symphony. And I was listening to it, and I think it probably was Milpitas Junior College Amateur Symphonic Group or something. It's horrible. It was out of tune. The tempo was okay, a little bit slow, but the music was absolutely irresponsibly bad. How could you get this many people together in one group and actually, well, obviously it had to be a live broadcast, because they don't record this kind of stuff. And at the end it turned out to be a very famous conductor, and a very famous orchestra playing it. So we had to explore it a little further. And I took out my fiddle and tried playing a note without a tune, but I'm okay. I tried playing a double stop. And I could not get a double stop into tune. We play 2 notes at once without a tune. I began exploring through this. Point is, all pitches, all sound things were depressed in their frequency. And you heard them as a lower note, but it was not depressed in a uniform way as if you put your thumb on the outside of an LP and slowed everything down. It was depressed in an additive way, in which you took away 43 cycles, so to speak, from each note. And hence anything was harmonic was totally aharmonic, out of sight. And so I began exploring this one. It's a little thing. I explored it. Indeed, it's consistent with that in this passage where there was one interesting experiment on 2 people with perfect pitch, and one was with the pitch was struck with a piano strike. The other pitch was with a sine wave generator, so you couldn't argue harmonic language with pitch. And what was done, what was done was play a note, have the person say what the note was, record the note, what it really was, and see what the error is. And we plot the error like this, and as the drum came on, the error got big, and then finally came down again, and finally went back to the baseline. So in essence, we have found a way of almost objectively measuring the chronology of a drug that affects the mental process. It's fascinating. Wait, no visual. What the hell uses it? Well, my first thought was if I ever want to compete in a blind audition for a place in the symphony, and I say I was a so-so cello player, and the guy on the other side of the street was maybe a little bit better cello player, I put some of this in his coffee. Funny is, this stands out as being a material that affects the auditory. I'd love to take the compound that was two isopropyl groups in this, without the methoxy. With the methoxy, is a different compound entirely. I would love to get that and put a carbon-11 in there, and get it in the brain. And we also have the keys and the positron, which is tomography camera, and how to make carbon-11 very simply. You go to positron, and you can make carbon-11 in about 3 hours. Get carbon-11 into this molecule somewhere, I'm not quite sure where I put it. Maybe an isopropyl group, phase, and get it into the brain, and see where it goes in the section of the brain, because it doesn't go to the visual, it goes to the auditory. And, golly, half the people who are nutty, more than half, have they hear things, they don't see things, they hear things. I'm telling you the way I talk with God, or this kind of thing. Auditory, not vision. And so maybe you could find between people who are normals and people who are schizophrenic a thing that could use this as a code for determining the localization of the auditory distortions that are sometimes a symptom of mental illness. Never done it, but you still like to do it someday. Pursue it on. The methoxy, the hydroxy group in that fourth position, the psilocin thing, I've always been intrigued by it. Psilocybin, psilocin, everyone's talked about this in the mushroom world. And in animals, psilocybin has a great big horrible water-soluble hydrophilic group on the oxygen. And out here is a very hydrophilic ammonium ion at the end of the chain, then the ammonium ion, forms a thing that is very water-soluble. But in the body of animals, at least, it's found that that big phosphate group is ripping right off, and what's left is the hydroxy and actually indole, an active material, certainly active in man, and symptomatically the same activity as psilocybin. And just about 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 months ago, a work was done in Switzerland that shows that in man, that phosphate group comes off, and the active material is silent. Someone asked me the other day about the stability of the alcohol solution of psilocybin. I said quite casually it would be quite stable. And the reason is because methanol in alcohol is very often used for extraction of psilocybin from mushrooms. It's a water-soluble extract, a beautiful white crystal solid. The free phenol, the free indole is turns blue quite easily. You may keep it in the cold, in the dark, in under inert atmosphere, and it still discolors quite rapidly. As you saw, it proves it quite stable. So I made some of those. I made groups out in my 5 position. Then explored yet further, discovered that if you put groups down in here, you don't need these at all. Made materials such as methyl group here. In fact, this compound is an interesting one. This, rather than the 5-methoxy alpha-methyltryptamine, I took advantage. I will draw one more very picture. Please put up with it. This is the structure of serotonin, which is one of the major transmitters, neurotransmitters, and functional of the brain. The serotonin thing. And so I said, why? Serotonin, and everyone talks about serotonin is kind of neat because everyone talks about it being the thing that is important in the brain, the thing, the axons of which are chewed up by MDMA in animals, and the thing that might possibly contribute to human troubles with excessive MDMA use. And this is never been established in man, but it's certainly a real possibility. And if you put serotonin into the bloodstream, none of it gets in the brain. It doesn't get in the brain because it's got a great big polar group at the right-hand end, nitrogen, which is hydrolyzed off quite readily by the monoamine oxidases. And it's got a great big polar OH group at the other end of the brain that's water-soluble. It doesn't like to go through blood-brain barriers and stuff. And so I said, why not make this compound so it will go through the blood-brain barrier? So, whereas phenethylamine is deaminated, with a methyl group there, it will not be deaminated anymore. So this protects it from enzymatic destruction. Then in place of the hydroxy group, I put a methoxy group on, which makes it suddenly not polar and should go into the brain okay with that. So I named this compound alpha-O-dimethylserotonin, DMS, and went at it with some caution, and discovered that it is extraordinarily potent at 2 or 3 milligrams, taken orally into the brain. So this is a very interesting compound. Explored it quite a bit. I had, most people had, at least in our first trial, almost everyone in our research group had rather vivid nightmares, not very nice nightmares. Buildings falling down, cracks opening in the earth, people falling into chasms, that. My case, I had a very marvelous nightmare in which an adventure and everyone died. But it was a neat one. I mean, it was an exciting death for everyone. It was a...
Were all of you in California having these cracks?
Oh, mostly in San Francisco.
Of course.
That's where people were. My memory reminds when I got that nightmare, I said that was great, and after I woke up with the dream, because it's a very vivid dream, but don't worry, I'll write it up later. And I did. And about 10 or 15 years later, I said, time has come to write up that nightmare. I remember every detail of it for 15 years with no notes. And I wrote a chapter in the second book called, the Pants Off. No, that was...
Hands off.
Pants Off is my slang name for it. The Pansophistry. That's a church of Pansophistry or Pants Off. Originally my notes were called Bare Ass, but that's because Pants Off. Anyway, I wrote that thing up, and everyone died at the end of the little scene, but it was a fun thing to reconstruct out of memory from that dream. I don't remember dreams at all. But 15 years later, that dream was still so good. It was totally written for a movie. Entries here, entries there, people coming in, people going out, dialogue. I found it absolutely fascinating topic. Anyway, made those alpha groups. Another little area that's not been explored at all. If you put a methyl group down in here, you block it from monoamine oxidase inhibition, so things become orally active. Acetyl groups down in here come off very readily and serve as unstable intermediates. What else have they done in the 15 area? Put a lot of this stuff together in Tikal. Not as expensive a collection of compounds as in Tikal. On the other hand, I hadn't done much work with it. I think in many ways, the generality, phenethylamines, there are people who love the phenethylamines and don't carry that much of the tryptamines. Vice versa. People who love the tryptamines, it's really the area to go, phenethylamines are kind of dull. To me, phenethylamines, rather than being dull, are warm, earth-like, pale, brown, friendly things without a great deal of drama and trauma. To me, tryptamines are vital, moving, dramatic things without the warm, earth-like components. So I find them both to be very interesting, but quite different in the nature of their general qualitative nature. Okay, where am I? Why am I here? Who why am I here? As vice president with the guy with big ears from Texas. Ross Perot. Yeah. Who was his vice president? Was it general or an admiral?
Admiral
Stockdale. Stockdale. He's the one who started this, why am I here? Yeah. Beautiful TV introduction. and no one got a valid answer to that. I happen to know the person, he's a member of the crowd in San Francisco. He is relatively dull, even in real life. Serotonin. What else is here? I've done not a great deal outside of the area, made a few analogs of PCP. Never played with ketamine at all. THC is now known. I had an interesting thing with THC. This is a non-nicotinous component of marijuana. I think some of you have heard of the drug. It's not actually explored. I was in a very interesting situation, time-wise. 3 minutes. You're going to be on through. I was when I was still at Dow. I had a very interesting visit concerning marijuana. Some people came out and they drew on a blackboard thing called Adam's 9-carbon compound. It's an analog of THC. And they drew a cascade of reactions on this side, on the blackboard. These people, I learned this from Edward Arsenal, which is the chemical warfare crowd of the Army. And they drew a bunch of structures on this side, but the compound that was the summation of these two lines of reasoning could not be drawn because they could not admit they were interested in it because it's classified and they didn't want to violate classification. But they wanted to ask people, chemists, they're going to industry, get people's ideas, how best to do this, how best to do this, without mentioning what the product is. And so I happened to be invited to come in, so I usually bouncing around. I said, well, what you're doing here is you're trying to make advertising carbon compounds. That's right. So I draw the structure for leave it alone, but they knew what I was talking about. I said, well, you can't just make that. Because you're introducing new chiral centers, and you've got 8 different isotopes can be made, isomers can be made. You've got to make all 8 isomers and compare one with the other. So it's better to put a nitrogen molecule when you have an alkaloid, you'll get your active component without having to worry about that. Then so I was actually, in a nice way, I got out, the conversation went on. About a month later, my father was left as widower. My mother's death, me and my ex-wife and my son and I went on a trip over to Europe to spend a year in France. And as we were going through the Caribbean, over near Trinidad, I got a knocking on the door during the cabin about 4th deck down, no outside, right at all. And the radio man, who became quite cozy later, said, I got a weird message for you, a radio message from RCD Little Company, an outfit in Boston, near Boston. And he gave it to me, and here was this argument. Please, when you get to Trinidad, give us a phone call. Our number is such and such, reverse call. Okay, I went back to bed. About 5 minutes later, I got another knock on the door. Again, the radio man. I got another message that's exactly the same. Don't bother with it. It's the same thing, the same duplicate. Thank you. I went back to bed. Next day, we phoned in Trinidad, and I got into a phone booth and called this number in Massachusetts, RCD Little. And he said, we're very interested in some comment you made to some people we are doing contract work with about putting nitrogen into tetrahydrocannabinol as the active component of marijuana and maybe making an alkaloid out of it. I believe the nitrogen position you mentioned was such and such. And I said, yeah, that was it. I said, how would you make that compound? I said, I'd go to the literature and see how parallel things are made and write it out from that. Well, I said, you're going to be landing in London in about 7 days and 24 hours, or 23 minutes or something. They knew exactly when it was going to be there. When you get there, would you please express mail to us from such and such your entire synthetic plans for this particular alkaloid thing, and we'll appreciate getting them at that time, because we have to file our patent within another 24 hours. So here I am on the Tucson, a big P&O line, I think it doesn't exist anymore, passenger ship, going across the Atlantic. The only library I have access to is the library up in the passengers library, which has an old copy of Thesaurus and not much else. And here I'm supposed to write a several-page synthetic process for synthesizing an alkaloid analog of THC. So I sort of retired and went back into photographic memory and pulled stuff out of the German literature on these cyclizations. And I wrote out about a 10 or 12-page plan and got into England, not email, there wasn't an email at the time, from the fast mail, over from England to Massachusetts. They got it just in time. They filed for the patent. The patent was issued finally to Bristol, I think the Bristol Myers or Bristol something laboratory. And when I got back, I was given $1 for having been an author on a patent. At that time, you didn't share the rewards of the patent. You got $1 for having been employed and contributed a patent. And it turned out you always had a little deal with the patent officer in the company. And you flip a coin, and if it came heads, he took your $1. If it came tails, he paid max $1, you got $2. You either had $0 or $2 for any patent you got in the industry at that time. And the thing actually went ahead into about phase 2 with the big company in Chicago, Allied or something close to Allied Pharmaceuticals. And it got to phase 2 and never went anywhere beyond that. An interesting compound, but it was an amalgamation of alkaloid and THC, which I was totally enamored with, and it was not a very interesting combination. And in general, I found if you have an interesting compound and another interesting compound, you try to bring them together and make a bigger, twice as interesting compound, it's dull still. It sort of falls apart, and nothing's fixed. You stick with what you've got and modify it in little increments and play with it. And it is the hour, and open for questions, and when I'm done, Ann will come up and really wow you. Thank you.
What you have is part of the self-preservation is to ignore 95% of the stuff that's out there. You have a person who's observing everything and remembers everything. He can't cross the street because he's fascinated by the green lights, by the cars, by the gravel, by the flies that are over there on the thing, by the fact that the car has a little blinker going. And if he pays attention to everything he saw, he'd be at life's risk to go across a crosswalk, crossing a street. So he learned to turn that off, turn that off, turn that. Watch for the green light. Watch where the first foot goes down there. Glance right and left. There's no car coming, and you get across the street safely. You have to ignore 99% of what's around you to be safe, to achieve where you want to achieve. What these things catalyze, letting you get access to those things you've been ignoring or have been denying.